Hello. The wine I'm looking at today is one I find really interesting because I've had to do quite a bit of digging to find out a little about it. I was allowed to taste this by a friend who'd had this stored in a cupboard for a long time and wasn't really sure how good it would be, but had been keeping it for a special occasion anyway. It's an Australian-made port. It's over 40 years old. And what it is, it's a Barossa Valley Tawny Port. It's a non-vintage Tawny made for the Airmen's Club at Royal Australian Air Force Base in Edinburgh. And this is Edinburgh in South Australia, by the way. So the only detail the label gives me is that this wine is a Tawny Port made by Rovalley Wines. And they're a company that were based in Rowland Flats in the southern part of the Barossa Valley that were established in 1919. They found out that Rovalley ceased trading in 1985 when the family who owned it sold the winery. So clearly this wine is at least 41 years old. The family concerned, however, the Liebich family, continue to make wines in the Barossa Valley under the Liebichwein label. Now, just a little detail that I've managed to find out about the Airmen's Club. Evidently, it was a recreational and social facility for members of the military working on the base at Royal Australian Air Force, Edinburgh. The base is located about 25 kilometres southwest of where Rovalley Wines were in the Barossa Valley. It's about a 40-minute drive between the two locations, and so this is a private label that was produced specifically for this one establishment. So the person who's likely to have made this wine is somebody called Ron Liebich. And Ron graduated from Roseworthy College in 1968 and evidently celebrated his 80th birthday in January of 2026. And is still making wines, including fortified wines, in Rowland Flats. Ron is the third generation of his family to make wines here, and the family's tradition has been to make wine from grapes grown locally on their own property. Evidently, it was Ron's grandfather, Benno Liebich, who started Rovalley Wines in 1919. The company grew into quite a well-respected Barossa Valley producer. Here we're talking about the 1960s and 70s. This was a time when table wines in this area were mostly sold in half-gallon flagons. The grape variety Shiraz was better known as Hermitage, and importantly, fortified wines would have been more common than table wines in the market locally. And in those days, it was Ron's uncle, Clarence Walter Liebich, who ran the winery. Ron's uncle was quite an important member of the winemaking fraternity in the Barossa. Evidently, he was one of the inaugural members of the Barrons of the Barossa, which is an institution into which people are inducted to recognise their revered status in Barossa Valley winemaking. Evidently, it was his uncle who persuaded Ron to take his career into winemaking. He encouraged him to go to Roseworthy Agricultural College and become an enologist. This was a time of change. Trends were moving more towards sparkling wines and table wines instead of sweet and fortified wines. So while Ron's brothers tended the vineyards, it was he who trained to be the winemaker and was able to hone his skills in the family business, making a broad variety of wines, everything from sparkling and still table wines through to fortified styles of wine. As I say, Rovalley Wines was eventually sold in 1985. I can't see who the initial buyer was. I see that the winery was sold to Miranda Wines in 1999, but who owned it in between that, I couldn't find out. If anybody knows, it would be really interesting to learn. Evidently, the sale enabled Ron and his wife Janet to buy back their home and the vineyards. And Ron was able to continue to make small batches of wine every year, with the aim of starting his own winery. And this happened in 1992 when he got a winemaker's license and was able to build a shed that became the winery and the cellar door. In the meantime, however, Ron had also been storing the barrels that comprised the family's archive of fortified wines. So in fact, he was the custodian of nearly 80 years worth of blending stock, all in barrel. It was fairly natural for Ron to name his winery Liebichwein, evidently in Barossa German, means I love wine. So it was a fairly obvious play on their family name to take advantage of that. These days, in his own vineyards, Ron practices very natural methods, natural fertilisation, minimum tillage, and is actually moving towards biodynamic practices, although as far as I'm aware, there is no certification for that. But he is concerned in encouraging microbial activity in the soils to keep the soils alive, with the idea that healthy soils enables the vines to be healthy and to fight off disease. Now, while they've grown most varieties on trellising, evidently the Grenache and the Mataro or Mourvedre that they have for fortified wines is actually grown on bush vines. And although the Liebichs have bores for irrigation water, they try to keep irrigation to a minimum, with the idea that it's actually quality in the fruit that they're looking for rather than quantity. And they note that the fruit is picked at full ripeness. While many of the varieties that they pick are machine picked at night to preserve freshness in the fruit, their smaller premium parcels are entirely hand-picked. Harvest for the Liebich family starts in February, but goes on late into April to harvest high ripeness fruit for their fortified wines. They do make the point very clearly that all their fruit comes from this part of the Barossa Valley. The Barossa Valley, of course, has a long heritage of quality grape production dating back over 150 years. Ron and Janet own 26 acres of vines here. They're located on the eastern slopes of Rowland Flat, and this is at the southern end of the Barossa Valley between Lindok and Tanunda. Soils here are very fertile, and they range between something that's described as black biscay and more red-brown earth. The climate is Mediterranean in its nature, with warm summers and cool, wet winters. The vineyards here capture cool gully breezes throughout the summer and manage to stay free of frost during the winter. Rainfall here on average is about 515 millimetres a year, so a little bit of supplementary irrigation can be quite useful. Now, the Liebich family still grow quite a broad array of grape varieties. For the reds, they have Shiraz, they have Cabernet Sauvignon, they have Merlot, they have Grenache, they have Tempranillo, they have Mataro, Petit Verdot, Pinot Noir, and Red Frontignac. For whites, they have Semillon, Gewürztraminer, and Muscat Gordeaux. As I say, Ron is 80 years old and has an entire lifetime's stock of blending wines in barrel at his winery. The estate-grown fruit that goes into this wine is some of the later fruit that's harvested each year and has high sugar levels. This Barossa Valley Tawny is likely to be a blend of bush vine-grown Grenache wine with a grape spirit that will be added during fermentation but after pressing to stop that fermentation so the wine retains sugar. I don't actually have a sugar level for this, but I would assume it's somewhere in the region of 80 to 100 grams per litre, leaving it fully sweet. And the wine matures in different sizes of old oak barrel, probably under quite warm conditions, so you get a certain amount of evaporation, you certainly get oxidation going on, and the wine can be in these barrels for decades, gaining complexity, gaining depth and concentration through that aging process. The wines are then blended prior to bottling, and here the winemaker's skill is to combine complex older wines with younger, fresher wines to provide both complexity of age and a fresher fruit element. The wine should be ready for drinking on release. Having said that, this wine is clearly over 40 years old. So one of the questions that I've been asked a few times is how long ports will age. For a fortified wine like this, whose alcohol I would assume is somewhere in the region of 18 to 20% alcohol, will continue to be beautifully drinkable for decades. It may not particularly improve in bottle. I very much doubt that this was a particularly expensive port at the time it was sold. I think it's the sort of thing that would probably sell for $20 to $30 a bottle these days. The sort of thing I'm sure the Airmen's Club would have served at mess dinners, formal dinners, that sort of thing. It's a good way to round off a formal meal. So with a wine this old, I wouldn't be too worried about it being undrinkable. Normally, ports like this will have aged very well. So let's see what we make of it, shall we? First, to look at the colour, this has a sort of quite a deep, nutty brown. There's an orange element at the rim. There is perhaps still just a hint of ruby in there, but in general, that is quite a tawny, brownish colour. Swirling it, as I say, the wine is likely to have somewhere in the region of 18 to 20% alcohol and probably 80 to 100 grams per litre of sugar. Not surprisingly, it's quite slowly forming tears that are not rapidly descending down the glass. It's quite viscous. It's sticking to the sides of the glass there. Now, as I've been sitting here talking to you, I've been getting wafts of the aromas, and they are quite pungent. And so let's have a look at them more closely. But you have developed fruit aromas. There are sort of dried, concentrated aromas. This is a wine that will have concentrated aging in barrel under possibly quite warm conditions in the Barossa Valley. That will have led to some dehydration. The fruit will have been very ripe when it was picked. And so there are sort of notes of raisins, notes of sultanas. There's a lovely note actually of sort of dried fig. There are some hints of wood that are well integrated with that. Sort of more cedary notes, less vanilla. There's almost a sort of dustiness in that sort of way coming through. There are perhaps some hints of maderization there, perhaps some slightly smoky notes. There's quite a lot going on in what is quite a powerful nose. That's quite enjoyable. So it's for taste. The wine is rich and sweet. It's full-bodied. There is a hint of spirit coming through. But in general, actually, that's really well married with that really quite dried, think sort of flavour there. There are hints of slightly more juicy, perhaps sultana notes. I wouldn't say so much raisin. I would think of raisin as being sort of darker and more concentrated than this. It still has quite a sort of a lively aspect. One of the things is that this is likely to be a wood-aged tawny port. Some base-level tawny ports that come from Portugal can actually just be a blend of red and white port, which in that case is going to be a much more simple fruit expression. Won't have the complexity of the oxidative aging and the slight notes of wood that you get on the nose and just on the back of the palate there. The alcohol's rich, the structure is smooth. There's a little bit of acidity there that's just actually helping the freshness to counteract the warmth of the alcohol. There are raisin notes on the finish that are actually lasting quite well. There are some nutty elements. There's not a huge complexity to the wine, but it's certainly concentrated and very enjoyable. In terms of giving it a score, I think this is probably a wine that justifies a score somewhere in the region of 89 or 90 points out of 100 for its longevity and some of the secondary notes that it's showing. This is a relatively straightforward wood-aged port, but it has actually developed quite well in bottle. I don't think it's been particularly well cellared. You can see the state of the label isn't great. So actually its robustness and its longevity is really impressive. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, it would be fantastic if you could press the like button for me. If you think this video is interesting and you'd like to watch more of them, do please subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would be fantastic. Do just sign up and set yourself an alert so that you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you think you have friends who would like to watch the video, it would be fantastic if you'd consider forwarding it to them. I'd really appreciate your help in that way as I try to build up this channel. I can't leave a link below in the notes to the Wine Searcher webpage for this wine, but I will leave a link that will enable you to find your way to the wines of Ron Liebich. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch the video, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time in the near future and come and join me for another tasting. Hopefully, I'll see you there. Bye for now.